Afternoon all, let's have a look at the fantastic game 3 today. It was pretty fantastic compared to the first two games, so I hope you're all fully awake when we go through this. Knight f3, already a bit of a surprise. Magnus repeats the Reti opening of game 1, which didn't seem to give him much of an advantage at all. Did he have something prepared here? Well, Vishy replied with d5. So, like game 1 now, g3 and now g6. But here comes the first detour from game 1. We see the move c4. And the most common reply for black, according to my live book, is just d4, gaining a bit of space in the centre. Maybe Magnus had prepared for that though. You don't know these things. He might have prepared for all these main alternatives. e6 is another popular move here, or c6. But Vishy maybe surprised Magnus with d takes c4. This is quite rarely played. It seems to offer white more central pawns, and white can regain this pawn on c4 immediately with the move queen a4 check. So now white seems to have a small nagging advantage here in terms of the extra centre pawns, potentially at least. So how is black going to fight in the centre? Well, in this position, if knight d7, perhaps white doesn't even need to capture immediately. White could play like knight c3 or just fianchetto. There's no hurry to take that. If he does take immediately, it's no big deal. This is okay. But actually, bishop d7 is also possible, but knight c6 was played, and potentially this sets up a nasty pin which could be exploited with knight e5. So black's got to be a little bit careful when playing knight c6 here. And in fact, now we see a delay on taking on c4, bishop g2, where white's potentially now threatening knight e5 to have 3 pieces on that c6 knight. Vishy plays bishop g7, which covers the e5 threat. That knight e5 is not on the cards here. And now queen takes c4 looks quite sensible, but it was delayed yet again with the move knight c3. So definitely in this position, more usual was just queen takes c4 here is the most usual move, but knight c3. So the idea now is most certainly that if knight f6, this would be a major mistake in this position because of knight e5, because that bishop would be blocked viewing e5, keeping control of e5 here. And this would offer white a significant advantage actually, this position. For example, if black castled, then white can inflict some structural damage, can take on c4 here, and wait to take on c6. So say rook b8, c6 isn't going anywhere very quickly, and even if it's protected like this and not here, it can be taken, and white's better. So that's definitely to be avoided. This knight c3 a little bit tricky. Black could consider a move like knight h6 just to keep a view on the e5 square, and the game could continue like this, where it's not such a big deal. The knight's coming back into the centre and keeping the grip on d4. This position is about equal here. So we see actually against knight c3, although knight h6 looks like an idea, the move e5 is also satisfying the needs of the position to cover this e5 threat, and this knight can actually be deployed to e7 now if needed. So here we see queen takes c4, and in fact knight ge7. Both sides now castle, and now we see d3. So it looks as though white's got maybe a tiny advantage at the moment. It's like a reverse Sicilian. White's potentially got this pressure on the c file, but black has a good grip over the d4 square right now. So it swings and roundabouts. Black plays actually now h6. This rules out any knight g5 manoeuvres which might be useful, bishop g5 pinning the knight. So here we see now bishop d2, so preparing to make use maybe of the c1 square. Also knight e4 to c5 might be interesting in the future. The c5 square is often sensitive in Sicilian positions. It will be c4 from the black perspective or c5 from white. This c-file pressure could be made use of. Now Vishy plays a structural move with great structural intent, rather knight d4. So the idea is to try and put pressure on e2 potentially if white took. This is potentially a dangerous backward pawn to have here. And in fact Magnus did take here. What other option apart from taking is there? It's difficult to tolerate that knight on d4. It's getting quite dangerous. Say rook ac1. This is really potentially quite dangerous. Maybe black can even consider just taking here. In fact, this should be okay, and then c6 to blunt the c-file. But the knight was actually snapped off, which changes the structure radically after e takes d4. White's getting more pawns on the queen side potentially. We see knight e4. If black can make use of this e-file and try and bear down later on e2, that would be an ideal use of this semi-open e-file. But white has got pressure here, and if any c6 happens, then we would have a minority attack potentially on the queen side with moves like b4, b5 in theory. So both sides have interesting plans emerging from this change of pawn structure here. Black immediately tries to neutralize actually the c-file with c6. And we see now bishop b4 pinning the e7 knight. So the bishop seems to be quite handy on this diagonal and reasonably annoying for black. Bishop e6, the queen now goes to c5. Pardon me, the queen goes to c1, goes all the way back to c1, which is a bit of a surprise. Maybe queen c5 is a major alternative to consider here, just threatening the knight on e7. But maybe just knight f5. And this looks okay actually for black. What is white actually threatening here? Potentially black's got a5 on the cards. So this doesn't seem to be much of an issue. So perhaps this is why queen c1 was chosen. It retains the idea that maybe this bishop coming back to d2 could pressurize h6, try and cause some weaknesses or disruption. We see now bishop d5. So exchanging off light square bishops usually is quite dangerous for the white king, but here it's more of a positional emphasis. I mean, just to try and get pressure eventually down the e-file and try and get these pawns moving. If these pawns can be made mobile, they're kind of fixed at the moment. Later b6 c5 would mean c4 as a strategic break eventually if it can be prepared. So getting these pawns moving is a longer term objective here for black. We see a4 from Magnus, as though a5 and a6 might be a dangerous threat structurally. b6, and now an interesting decision again, voluntarily giving up the dark square bishop. And this is often part of a light square campaign to weaken black on the light squares. Often knights can be used on both colour complexes, so getting rid of that knight can help the light square campaign of white to try and control all the light squares. We see now a5, and now rook ab8, trying to keep the pawns intact on the queen side. Rook e1, and now rook fc8 looks as though c5 and c4 is going to be a dangerous long-term threat. A takes b, a takes b. And now very interesting move indeed, queen f4. There's a potential idea of knight d6 being useful here to then take on d5. So black addresses that with rook d8, and then we see h4, and this gives an interesting square potentially for the bishop later on h3. Also, of course, h5 would help carry on a light square campaign of attack. If black can be encouraged with g5, he's weakening the light squares. So king h7 was played here. h5 needs to be precisely calculated if it's going to be played in this position. Here, if h5 was played, perhaps g5 might actually be viable on check, king g8. This might not be such a big deal in this position. With this light square bishop on d5, it can retreat at any point at e6. It should be okay for black. So Magnus rejects actually h5, but continues instead now with knight d2. He welcomes the exchange of light square bishops here. We see now bishop e5. Is the queen being driven anywhere useful here after bishop e5? That's a major concern with such a move. In fact, after queen g4, there's a very interesting creative idea for the queen which is revealed now as black plays h5 here, which at least stops the h-pawn. If h5 wasn't played, then maybe white's threatening just to take on d5 and then play h5. If bishop e6 instead was played, just queen e4, we could have a repetition, and that would be to the disappointment of all spectators around the world, a repetition of attacking the queen. But thankfully, no, we didn't get that. We got h5. And the queen now goes to a very, very interesting square. Well, how many squares are there? In fact, this is the only square, queen h3, but in superb hypermodern tradition, putting pressure on the centre from over here, this battery is aesthetically very interesting. So bishop e6, pushing the queen to where it seems to be ideally useful for this battery to encourage black to put pawns on dark squares and weaken the light squares. But there's an upside to this c5, that black is getting on with the longer term plan of increasing pawn mobility. This c4 break not only can liberate this rook potentially, it can create a dangerous passed pawn or even a pawn coming to c3. So this is approaching, this is a very, very dangerous aspect to factor in here. We see knight e4, and it looks as though the immediate knight g5 could be a nuisance here to take the light square bishop. Ahead of this we see king g7, but now the question is repeated, knight g5, even though it's not check. But where can the bishop actually usefully go here? I think Vishy had indicated he looked at various possibilities but wasn't really convinced with them for moving this bishop. He ended up playing b5, but let's have a quick look. If bishop f5, for instance, here, maybe just bishop e4 trying to get rid of the light square bishop could be useful. If bishop g4, bishop f3, once the light square bishop is removed, then black's game is more frozen. There's more pressure on the light squares, and white always at the moment retains this control of the a file, not a7 but this a8 square. This queen is across the whole diagonal here. So can black actually refuse the exchange of light square bishops here? It can be continually harassed with bishop e4 here in any case. So we get a very interesting decision where if the bishop goes to b3, it's a bit of a tactical target. Let me just rook a3. So Vishy decides actually a kind of positional sacrifice in terms of structure at least. He plays b5, and Magnus in the press conference after the game indicated he underestimated this b5 plan, just giving up the light square bishop. So very, very interesting here. The thing is, what would happen if white took? Because actually Magnus decided against it. He didn't take the bishop on e6. Now, in terms of it being a kind of positional sacrifice, what I mentioned earlier is that black would get either pressure, it seems, on the F file, or could keep the structure intact. If this had occurred, knight takes e6, he could keep his structure intact with queen takes e6 and look forward to c4 in the near future, trying to get dangerous passed pawn. And this could actually go downhill for white, potentially, even with the opposite coloured bishops. This is quite dangerous now, this kind of scenario. If we just follow this through a bit, with c4 approaching, we can see that actually it could cause some damage for white if a pawns ended up like this. This is a creeping, increasing advantage where white could actually be completely squashed on the queen side. So this kind of scenario is very, very dangerous to entertain, even though it's opposite coloured bishops. So perhaps that starts to explain why knight takes e6 in this position might not be desirable. And then we haven't even looked at f takes e6. With structural damage there comes the f file, but this is far less convincing. I think rook a5, and white possesses that a file and could do something quite serious with it soon, as well as try and force these pawns onto dark squares and get a light square blockade. White would actually be threatening bishop c6 with this move, as well as preparing to double. So if bishop d6, bishop c6, this seems to be a bit murky here for black. If b4, then white holds that a file, and this could be quite unpleasant now with a rook coming to a7. And it's actually better for white. The queen could come back in the game potentially now with king g2 for queen c1. So that's very, very interesting, and I think that would start to favour white actually. So I think the best, if knight takes e6 had been played, would have been to taking with queen e6, keeping the structure intact. But this is all academic, because actually after this b5, Magnus played a very, very interesting move. In addition, very, very dramatic now. At move 28, he has to do something because he's going to be squeezed on the queen side quite radically. So he plays actually e3, a positional sacrifice of his own, trying to offer this b2 pawn. Let's see now what happened. Black really has to take, surely, on e3, or maybe there's an alternative with rook b6. It might be possible this is an alternative, but because any time e takes d happens, we've got bishop takes d4, as long as e6 is not a disaster. So that might be playable as well, but more direct, if a bishop is needed on d4, is d takes e3. Now white clearly can only take with the rook here, otherwise g3 is dropping. So rook takes e3. Now here there's a loose pawn, and it had to be investigated a bit by Vishy surely. But in the press conference he had indicated that he thought white had enough compensation for this pawn. If bishop takes b2, a question came up on Reddit recently about losing material, what to look out for, and I mentioned quality and time, and here white can get extra quality and time by increasing the pressure on e6, forcing black's pieces passive, for e6, and now bishop h3, and we can see all the pieces coordinating here on e6, 4 of these pieces coordinating, and it should be okay for white. White has enough compensation. In fact, it's after bishop h3 that the evaluation from Vishy Anand himself, he thought white had enough play for the pawn here in this position. But if we followed it through with bishop d4, we can actually try and illustrate this. If white now takes on e6 with this unpinning move, so now black is threatening to move the bishop, so taking on e6, white can still possess this a file with rook a2 and have enough compensation. I think Vishy Anand's intuition for the evaluation of position matches concrete variations here. White has a nice playground here to play with of ideas, having that a file control. White's definitely at least okay here. The black pawns aren't really going anywhere that quickly. If they dared move, I mean, say b3, then queen b5. White's got enough pressure to stop these pawns. there can even be, in this position, an idea like this, a positional exchange sacrifice. Well, the rook hanging in any case, so that's irrelevant. So, okay, so if we go back to rook takes e3, we see a quieter move played, bishop d4, which does seem to intensify pressure on f2. And if white's ever going to take on e6, then maybe the f file is going to be helping that bishop on d4. Knight takes e6 is an option for white, but it's not played yet. Rook e2 is played. And now c4. Vishy thought he had enough counterplay here with c4. He's not minding this structural damage in the weak pawn on e6. Says he can manage with it because he has got that f file pressure. It is now taken, so this is put to the test. So we have some, pardon me, we have some fragmentation of pawns here with e6 and g6 now weakened. Bishop e4 immediately targets g6. C takes d3. And now there's a little little trap here. If bishop takes d3, then black has the strong bishop takes f2 check. This is very unpleasant for white. If rook takes f2, rook takes d3, and this looks dire. So white actually played rook d2, temporarily a pawn down. And here we see an aggressive move, queen b4. Also interesting to consider is queen rook f8. White has to be a bit careful. If rook f8, rook ad1. Engines are getting excited in this position actually after rook ad1 with rook takes f2. Is there much cause of excitement? This kind of scenario, you have to bear in mind the opposite colour bishops, so it might not be such a big deal, even if black takes that pawn here. If white can maintain a light square blockade, it's not going to be such a big deal. So that has to be borne in mind, the opposite colour bishop scenarios and the potential for blockading. But okay, so queen b4 was chosen instead. Now if rook takes d3, then rook f8 or queen takes b2, they look appetizing for black. So Magnus actually played rook ad1, keeping hold of b2 for the moment. Sorry, I just want to rewind with something. Sorry, no, I don't. Rook ad1, bishop takes b2 is played at move 34. Here there was a question in post conference of the game. Rook f8, trying to keep the pressure on. Does it keep the pressure? Vishy wasn't convinced. He thought bishop takes d3. And here, if say rook takes f2, then just taking here, rook f8, and here Vishy thought queen e4 was good enough for white to have a good position. He didn't see anything clear here. Again, this opposite colour bishop scenario is not such a big deal. It's about equal chances. It's going to be a draw most likely. So rook f8. Okay, instead of bishop takes b2, this rook f8 might not be that dangerous. Something of note though is in this position queen d6 actually threatens the sneaky queen takes g3 check here, which looks quite dangerous, or rook takes f2. So here, how would white actually defend this position? If queen e4, this is interesting on g6 and on d4 simultaneously, we can get some sharp variations which are a bit crazy. Just offering G3. Now Queen G2. Again, we're in scenarios which are okay for white. Really, it's not such a big deal. With the opposite colour bishops, it's not such a big deal. So here, okay, after Rook 81, Bishop takes B2 was played. Queen F3. So Magnus, very slowly but surely, he's going to get D3 back under his own terms. Bishop F6, and now finally he takes on D3. Rook takes D3, and now Rook takes D3, and it seems as though in theory there's some life left in the position for black to continue with Bishop D4. It has certain tactical threats like checking on E1, which look dangerous in conjunction with Rook F8. If we just quickly investigate this, even though it looks as though on the surface it could be quite good, let's see. So, sorry, Rook takes D3, Bishop D4. Let's go with Rook D1, Rook F8. Queen D3 now is actually threatening Queen takes D4 check. So if Rook takes F2, that would be a disaster here, because if Queen takes D4 is actually check. If black in this position, though, does play something like E5, it seems there's pressure on F2, which is significant here. Let's examine this now. If Rook B1, let's go with, say, Queen C4. And if white takes, we've got seemingly a dangerous outside pass pawn here, along with pressure on F2. But even in this scenario here, if F2 is protected for a moment, the king moves up to unpin the pawn to be able to move the pawn soon. Here it seems again this opposite colour bishop scenario is becoming a familiar tune. It's not really offering that much in terms of actual practical real world winning chances. It's just theoretical extra pawn here. The opposite colour bishops are always going to help draw the game. So again, it's not really such a big deal in this position to try and keep the pressure on by playing a move like Bishop D4. It seems exciting that there's threats of Queen E1 and Rook F8, but they don't seem to amount to anything in particular. So that's pretty interesting. But I guess white has to be quite accurate here, though. But with a move like Queen E2, even it seems demonstrable that white's okay. So Vishy actually peacefully offered an exchange of a pair of rooks with Rook D8. Magnus took on D8. Bishop takes D8. Now Bishop D3 not only vacates E4 and also the diagonal for Queen B7 check to threaten taking the pawn back. This also means, well, it means it's very difficult for black not to lose a pawn now. It's now virtually dead equal. In fact, we see in fact Queen D4 volunteering just a simple capture of the pawn with Bishop takes B5. After Queen F6, a draw offer at move 40 was made, and this is the time control. Magnus didn't immediately snap it up actually here. He played on, so they've got extra time. He went for a break away from the board. He came back. I mean, he played on. He played Queen B7 check, rejecting the draw offer. So playing on after the first time control, so they get an extra hour each, I believe. Bishop E7, King G2, and now white's pawn chain kind of undermined with G5. Just getting rid of all the pawns is a way of guaranteeing a draw here. Even if white ends up a pawn up, black can always sacrifice the bishop if it's just one pawn to draw. So we see HG, Queen takes G5, which looks to neglect a bit E6, but this is no big deal to lose the E6 pawn here. if white's just left with one pawn and black sacrifices the bishop for the last pawn and the queens are off, then it's going to be a draw. So h4, queen c7, h takes g, queen takes g3, e5. It's absolutely a dead draw, and it's quite amusing that they're playing on a little bit. Queen takes g3, fg, bishop c5, king e4. It doesn't matter if black loses that pawn, it's still a draw. He protects it tokenly. Bishop f5, sorry, rather king f5, bishop f2, and finally, after king takes e5, bishop takes g3 check. They agree a draw on move 51. That was an enormous game compared to the first two games, much bigger than the first two games together, and much more exciting, much more dramatic. A lot of potential risks and opportunities in this game. Fundamentally, with the opposite colour bishop scenarios, a lot of the seemingly dangerous engine possibilities didn't seem to be really offering real-world winning opportunities. It's just technically, black, up in material, various parts of the variations we saw. So a very, very interesting game today. Hope you enjoyed that. I think the match is really starting to turn into a very, very exciting one. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.